Please be seated.
Dear all, it is an absolute pleasure to welcome you all here today at this very special occasion in the aula of Maastricht University. And of course, a very warm welcome to family, to friends, distinguished guests, colleagues, and of course, to Professor Frank Boons himself, because after all, you're the reason that we're all here today. My name is Marielle Heiltjes, and I'm the Dean of the School of Business Economics, and it's my privilege today to act as the pro-rector for this and chair this academic ceremony. Now, today we together celebrate our chair of political economy of sustainability. And it is a chair, as you undoubtedly all know, whose work becomes more urgent by the day. With the current complexity, the interdependent challenges that face us, escalated economic, environmental crisis, shifting geopolitical realities, persistent social inequalities. It's a chair whose work, by definition, needs to be more than just an academic pursuit, because only, as you will also hear, as a transdisciplinary endeavor, can it also inform policy, reform institutions, and challenge unsustainable practices that are embedded in the structures that we have collectively created. Now, it is especially fitting that this chair is held by Professor Frank Boons, because he is a distinguished scholar with an international reputation, and Frank brings a deep understanding of sustainability transitions, systems innovation, and governance. And his work has bridged disciplines, informed public policy, and contributed to reshaping how we think about economic systems and their ecological foundations. But before I invite Frank to deliver his address, I would like to elaborate a little bit more on the person behind the chair. I know you have been waiting for this, Frank. Because after all, the human being behind the chair is as important to our community as a School of Business and Economics as the knowledge and expertise that that person brings. And as Frank has been working with us for quite some time now already, it only required a very quick virtual tour walk around the MSI block to get some impressions. Well, Frank is perceived as a man with a mission that he would like to have realized yesterday rather than today. Impatient at times, analytical with a never-sleeping critical mind, politically savvy and fond of creation. Creation in work project, as most of you will probably know, but also in music. And I think that a concert or sound bath, whatever would be the most appropriate definition of what you create, composed on your modular synthesizer, would be a cool event to organize for colleagues within the school at some time in the future. And see somebody in the first row laughing already, so that can either be that we should be happy with his concert, or that we should hide and dive. Well, now, Frank is a man with a drive that brings results, whether these are acquisition of impressive grants, publication of impactful research together with his colleagues at Maastricht Sustainability Institute, the development of a sustainability roadmap for our university, SUM 2030. You can actually see it walking on the grounds towards in this building, or the generation of societal impact on circular economy topics in our region. Now, I hope this is a very short summary, and I have more information which I probably could not tell here, but I will share it over drinks if you're interested. But I hope that also this already clarified that we as a school are proud of the achievements of Frank. And I think, because I can't take too much time, it's now your turn to tell us about your field, passion, and plans. And you don't have to look so relieved at this time. So the time has come that I formally invite Professor Boons to deliver his inaugural address entitled The Economy as Social Material Process and Transdisciplinary Endeavor. Frank, the floor is yours.
Thank you. I want to savor the moment a little bit. Sorry for that. Doesn't happen very often. Dear Rector Magnificus, dear colleagues, friends and family. I think I'm going to need my glasses anyway. I thought I wouldn't need them, but I'm going to use them anyway. The metaphor that I will use today to tie together 4 focal points for my work here at Maastricht University is water. And it will help us to understand, first of all, how economies, as human activity systems, rely on and are affected by material resources, such as water, as a vital source of human life and energy, but also as a potential disruptor when it floods our cities and roads. It will help to probe the fact that such materials and their value are contested, as not everyone has equal access to them, or is equally protected from their harmful impacts. Thirdly, the sustainable management of water resources has been the basis for insight into the need to co-produce knowledge with system actors as part of robust forms of governance. And finally, water has been a central metaphor for Heraclitus, the philosopher who famously said, "No man ever steps in the same river twice, because it's not the same river and it's not the same man." I will use him as a figurehead for my reflections on the relevance of looking at the economy as a process, rather than as a fixed structure. So water connects process, social materiality, political economy, and transdisciplinarity in ways that I would like to dive in now. And it also means that I will have explained my title to you, which probably you have wondered about why did he choose that title. So in order to hopefully get everybody sort of along on my ride here, let's make this a little bit more tangible by introducing 2 examples that show the distinct ways in which water enters our lives. The first example is centered on the fact that nowadays water bottles are all around us. In some settings we see reusable bottles like this one, but very often we see single-use plastic bottles that are carried around and sold in supermarkets, on-the-go shops, and cinemas. And this was not the case 20 years ago. We drank tap water or other beverages, and we drank them not from plastic bottles, as we do now. This is a matter of interest, in part because of the negative impacts of single-use plastic bottles. We know they are a source of littering, microplastics, and marine pollution. So we try to recycle them, seeking to create one of the success stories of what we now call the circular economy. But plastic bottles replaced the system of reusable glass bottles, which means we moved from a circular to a linear system. And in the case of water, it is a substitute for tap water, a very efficient way of distributing drinking water. So why did we move away from distributing water that can be considered in several respects as inferior? So that first case centers on water as a vital source for human life. Water is also a source of disruption and loss of human life when excessive rainfall or severe weather events lead to floodings, hurricanes, and tsunamis. No matter how many people deny this in social media posts, such events are increasingly occurring more often than before. And here the key question is, how are these consequences distributed unequally across populations, even within cities? So those are my 2 cases that I will take a look at. But before we do that, or while doing that, I also want to develop my 4 focal points a bit more. Sorry, yeah. I am where I want to be, sorry. Before we take a closer look, I want to develop my focal points a bit more. And developing these points in relation to each other is important for me in the sense that I think that connecting them allows us to understand our economies as complex human activity systems a bit better. And this understanding is useful in and for itself, speaking to the public value of academic research and teaching, but also as part of the contribution I want to make in dealing with these societal challenges. So the term political economy, let's start there. This term has actually a quite long history from which somehow the modern discipline of economics sprang. I will not provide a detailed history of the term here, You can read it afterwards if you care to take a look at the little booklet that I make. But it is useful to be aware that the term points to a debate on what the role of politics is in producing societal wealth. And Adam Smith saw this as a question of the extent of involvement of regulators. A valid concern at the time, the 18th century, when rulers were actively engaged in appropriating valuable resources for their own security and use. So he used the term political economy very much in a derogatory sense. And The Wealth of Nation, his famous book, or one of his famous books, I should say, can be and often is read as making the case for how an economy prospers when it is left to the entrepreneurial activities of private actors. As Hirschman has described, at that time, private interest was seen as a force for good, as being able to rein in the dark passions. And subsequent contributors to political economy, such as Karl Marx, Max Weber, and Karl Polanyi, have theorized on how this led to societies where productions for markets led to so-called disembedding, an increasing disconnect between instrumentally rational logic of production and consumption on the one hand, and action based on substantive value positions. Separating economics and politics as academic disciplines can be seen as symbolic for the way in which we study the provision of human needs as separate from the debate about what actually constitutes societal wealth. And the case can be made that the neoliberalist revolution of the past decades has completed that separation by making political decisions subject to economic concerns. Politicians argue about budgets rather than concern themselves with the essence of politics, which according to Easton is the authoritative allocation of value. Let's leave history behind. I said I wasn't going to go into history, I did it anyway. I want to summarize now the perspective of political economy in 3 guiding questions. And for this I will define the economy as the way in which, as a society, we provide for human needs, where those needs, as soon as they go beyond mere survival, are shaped within material constraints by human values. The key word here is value, and that should be understood as more than just monetary value, just to be clear about that. So this is a picture of King Solomon making his Solomon judgment over a child contested by 2 mothers. And here it's not about the value of money, it's about the value of love, which clashes with the value of control and ownership. So in my definition of economy, which I'm, didn't come up with myself, I shared it with many other people, it encompasses much more than profit-making business and their consumers. It also includes, among many other things, the unpaid informal work done in households, the shared use of cars among friends, 1 car, and the way daily needs are met by food banks. These are all ways of providing for human needs, and especially when we are interested in transformative societal change, we need a definition of the economy that includes such alternatives to the dominant profit-based model. And based on this definition, political economy can be said to deal with 3 key questions. You can see that I'm not used to using a clicker. How do we define what is valuable? That is, how are decisions made on what an economy actually should provide? So this is the first question that, as a political economist, you can't just take for granted. And many economists say, well, we take needs as a given. As a political economist, you need to think about what actually are the human needs that our economy is providing for, and how do we decide which needs are actually the most important or the more important. The second question is, how do we produce that value? And that means who is involved in what activities that are needed to provide for those needs. And thirdly, and maybe most importantly, how do we distribute value? So how do we make decisions on who gets what? These questions work at the level of an individual activity. Compare bike sharing in a student home with bike sharing as a for-profit business. These are 2 ways of providing something that is deemed valuable in different ways and with different beneficiaries. But zooming out, these questions can take us to the level of economic systems and the value they produce, such as the circular economy at the regional and national level. Do we assume that in such a system value is well represented by gross domestic product, or do we need alternative values, such as sufficiency? And how can such alternative values be produced? Phrased in the form of these three questions, it immediately becomes clear why political economy is a crucial perspective to engage with in relation to questions of sustainability and societal resilience. Both challenges make us aware of taken for granted answers to the three questions and call upon us to rethink those answers. Let's take a look at our two cases from this perspective. Disposable PET bottles have become prevalent in the last 20 years. And while water is indispensable for our survival, it can be provided for in many different ways. I already mentioned this, tap water, you can also drink from a stream, you can buy a bottle of water in a restaurant. And preceding the use of plastic bottles in countries like the UK and the Netherlands, tap water was actually the main way in which we just provided for this need for water. And tap water was moreover the end point of a system of public provision. So it wasn't provided by companies, but it was provided by the government. Of course, this system still exists, it's privatized, but it has been partially substituted by water sold in bottles. And if you look at this slide above me, you see how the amount of water that is being consumed has risen, dramatically, I would say, consumed from bottles. And this is only until 2010. So you have to add another billion to that to get to the current situation. And you have to take into account that this is about the amount of water being consumed. Actually, in terms of bottles, the growth is even more pronounced because we use smaller bottles. As we used to buy water mainly in 1 liter bottles, and now we buy them in the small bottles that you can get everywhere. So the value delivered by the current system is contested internationally. Plastic bottles have been found contributing to littering waste and marine and indoor microplastics pollution with health and ecosystem effects that we don't understand fully yet. In terms of the distribution of value, a significant difference between the public and private provision is that in the latter case, water becomes a product that is sold for a profit. Firms producing, transporting and retailing bottled beverages benefit from this process of commodification. If we recycle the bottles, it generates income for recycling firms and thus contributes to national economic growth. We also have alternatives such as reusable bottles filled at the tap or at filling stations, and these alternatives fit with the developed practice of bringing water to work or leisure activities, delivering very similar value to users, but maybe not giving value to other parties. The case of flooding relates to several questions of value. A flooding causes human harm and suffering and destroys natural and human-made physical objects. This is very sort of vividly shown here in the picture that was taken after Hurricane Katrina. In the wake of a flooding, questions on how to prioritize dealing with those impacts show our definitions of value, which can differ depending on our position and perspective. Going beyond the immediate effects, questions of prevention require us to think about what we value as well. And in my view, I've given this example several times to different people, so you might recognize it, but the Dutch program Room for Rivers, that lasted, I think, for at least 20 years, is, in my view, an excellent example of a systemic approach to answering such questions. Because it's one way of assessing the relative value of property development in certain areas against the consequences or preventing the consequences of flooding. In terms of the distribution of value, floodings conform to a general pattern for disasters when negative impacts are unevenly distributed across society, with persons in vulnerable positions being much more adversely affected by them. So let me go to my second theme. If we look at the typical way in which economics deals with questions of disaster and disruption, it's through the lens of money. Whatever is destroyed or disrupted, even up to the point of a human life, we can express that as a monetary value. And there's nothing inherently wrong with that, as long as it doesn't crowd out other ways of looking at the economy. And this is one reason why the recent trend to create a circular economy is very welcome. Just looking at Arnold here. It confronts us with the fact that while our economy may be facilitated by money, it actually requires the continuous extraction of harvesting, transformation, and eventually the disposal of resources and materials like oil, wood, metals, concrete, etc., 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 etc. And this material base has been largely absent from economics, as well as the social sciences in general. There are exceptions, like Georgescu Roegen, who developed bioeconomics, one of the strands of the current discipline of ecological economics. But it's still routinely neglected as a component in economic analysis, which is evidenced by the largely absent data on the economy in material indicators rather than in financial indicators. In the Netherlands, like in other countries, we are only catching up now and sort of developing those kind of indicators where we actually say our economy has this amount of material going through it, and these types of material. So let's look at our examples again. For users, the PET bottle as a material object provides convenience. It's light, can easily be carried, can be taken in a bottle without leaking. So it has a lot of positives. It's also an eyesore. The discarded bottles left on pavements or in parks, floating in ponds and rivers. So it has it's a mixed bag, you would say. For the sellers of bottled beverages, the PET bottle is a marketing canvas. It's easy to shape in a recognizable form, can be fitted with brands and information. For waste collectors, the PET bottle is a premium addition to the flow of waste they handle. It has a high value because it can be separated easily and then sold to recyclers. In the context of a circular economy, materiality is often visualized as a so-called Sankey diagram. And this visual, it might look a bit complicated, but it's actually quite easy. If you think about the economy as a big box, then stuff comes in. On the left side, it goes out on the right side into the environment. In this case, it can also go to another economy. And sometimes stuff is circulated, which you see by sort of the flows that actually close the circle. And the thickness of the arrow shows how much of that material is actually coming in, being pushed through, and going out. And if you look at this picture, which is about PET bottles, not just water bottles, also other bottles in the European Union, then you can see how much of that material comes in the economy and leaves the economy. A lot is called leakage here, which mostly is waste, and only a very small amount is actually circulated. A disaster like Katrina creates, in addition to the tragic loss of human lives, an immediate and deep experience of our reliance on the material world. Losing your house and all of your belongings, seeing the roads that you take to school or work obstructed and destroyed. And everybody suddenly focuses only on where to find a place to sleep for the night, or where to find something to eat for your children. Zooming out, it raises questions about materiality in terms of how is this possible? Why did we build the infrastructure like this? What are we doing in terms of climate change? To what extent are we responsible for that, and how can we change that? The notion of social materiality builds on the realization that social process is always intertwined with materiality. Any material or object, or its absence, has an impact through the beliefs and values that human beings attach to it. Yet, sustainability challenges increasingly require us to face what Searle has called brute facts. Whatever a house means in terms of social status, in its essence, it is something that provides shelter to human life. So research into disruptions, shocks, and system breakdowns is important because as a social process, these are fundamentally different from processes of anticipation of possible future negative events. And we have sort of focused a lot on this kind of research on anticipation of possible events and not so much on adaptation to actually occurring change. My third point that I would like to touch upon with you. Tastes really good. The pictures that we just saw present a particular way of looking at the world, a world of objects, things that exist and connect with each other. And once we identify an object, we can dissect and analyze it. The areas in which a flooding took place, how many houses were affected, the number of bottles used every year, and the amount of waste recycled. And taking this perspective is kind of illuminating, you know, because we can analyze all those things, but we also lose something. And what we lose is the important notion of time. So the visuals that we looked at just now are like pictures, or are actually pictures, but they resemble pictures that you take at a family birthday. They can tell us a lot about one moment, but they don't really say very much about how people got to the party, what they were doing there, when they left, how they left, were they happy, were they sad, were they tired, etc. And likewise, our visuals show a picture of the maximum area that flooded. And in the case of PET, it shows us these amounts over a full year. Yeah, so the amount of material that goes through the economy in terms of plastic bottles in 1 year, or PET bottles. So it doesn't actually tell us anything about the ways in which people buy, use, and throw away these bottles, or how long it takes to process them into a new bottle, or how long it takes for those bottles to become little microplastic particles that end up in the ocean or in the body of a child. So using visuals like this is a choice, as the origin of this PET bottle flowchart helps us to see. I don't know if you've ever seen this picture, probably not, but this is actually a very old picture. It's kind of has the same structure as the one that we earlier looked at for the PET bottles. But this is actually a picture that was made by Charles Minard in 1869, and it shows the army of Napoleon when it was sort of entering into Russia. And the thickness of this beige flow, you see it diminishing because over time people die. So the army actually gets decimated over time. So what you see here is a very similar diagram, but contrary to the one that we looked at earlier, in this diagram time is actually completely present. So to take time into account, we start not with objects, but with process, the flow of events as they unfold in time. And a useful process perspective does recognize objects, otherwise we would sort of be doing quantum mechanics all the time when we want to study the economy. That's not very helpful. So we do recognize objects, but we don't take them for granted. We want to know how those objects came about, how they maintain themselves, and how do they dissolve themselves. And if I talk here about objects, then I'm not just talking about physical items like a PET bottle or a house or something like that. I'm also talking about initiatives, organizations like a firm or a university. Defined in this way, a process perspective is key to any understanding of social change and sustainability, as these topics require us to understand how new things can emerge, how the way in which existing things maintain themselves is sometimes disrupted, and how they eventually dissolve. True, this is not a novelty by any means. Several areas of study, including innovation, policy making, and management and organization, a process perspective is adopted at least in principle. What is less developed, however, is the use of systematic methods that do justice to this perspective. And this was for Wouter, Wouter Spekking from Rotterdam. We started working on this, I think, 15 years ago. This was actually the inspiration for us. We know that people talk about the process perspective, but what are actually the methods that we can use to study that in a systematic way? I'm not going to dig into that in great detail, but I'm very happy that both, you know, in the collaboration with Wouter as well as with people at MSI, we are now sort of making the next steps in the work on that. But I do want to give you a flavor of this work by working through our two examples quickly. It's useful to have a guiding question, which for PET bottles would be, how did we end up using millions of small single-use bottles every day globally to provide for our need of water? At the level of extreme granularity, this is the result of millions of people making routine decisions, while companies produce these bottles that are sold by retailers in individual transactions. If we use our theoretical and analytical insight to see how these very granular occurrences coagulate, we arrive at lineages, sequences of events that tell part of the story. So analytically, we can represent that in this way. So this visual, I'm not asking you to sort of, go into the detail of the individual numbers and stuff, of course. But it is interesting that we can represent a process like this as a network of events, where the dots are individual things that happen, and the arrows represent how those events lead into each other. And if we describe and analyze processes in this way, then we can actually sort of compare those processes. That's basically the idea of this kind of work. So we have the individual events, we have the way they are linked, and then the gray areas are actually lineages, and they are sort of the building blocks of the story that you could tell about PET bottles, or the story that you could tell about Hurricane Katrina and the impact. So this image is actually taken from a paper that I wrote together with Wouter, or that Wouter wrote together with me, I should say, because it's his PhD work. And this is about the emergence of a biochemical cluster in Terneuzen. And there we studied how the collaborations in that cluster actually came about. Katrina, when viewed as a longitudinal process, is a story of how human settlement in a river delta becomes increasingly unbalanced through the interplay of several lineages: economic and technological change, political maneuvering, persistent enactment of cultural stereotypes, and ecosystem dynamics. And with Katrina, the puzzle really is, how is it possible that in an area that has been flooded multiple times, 1915, 1927, 1967, and then in 2005 when Katrina happened, each time with severe consequences, how can it be that such an area is in a state in 2005 where still so much, the impact can be so severe in terms of human life loss and also material damage? So as with the Netherlands, river deltas are a favorite place for people to settle due to the richness of the sediment the river carries there. And the floodings actually spread this sediment onto the land, making it fertile, so that's why people want to live there. When the number of inhabitants rises, floodings become actually a hazard rather than a benefit or a boon. And then containing those floodings through systems of levees, dijken in het Nederlands, means sedimentation doesn't happen anymore. And what happened in New Orleans is that actually relative to the sea, the city started to sink. Yeah, so the city became sort of lower than the sea. We all know this, of course, in the Netherlands, how that stuff works. And in addition to that, the discovery of oil led to very quick exploitation, because the local authorities that were actually responsible for building the levees, or building the dikes, they were also able, or they were the owners of the rights to extract the oil. And extraction of the oil required the building of canals and other infrastructure which allowed high water to come land inward with more ease. And in planning all those works, the risk of flooding was consistently sort of seen as, we don't have to worry about this too much. At some point it was even considered to be irrelevant or non-risk. And to house the increasing population, in part due to increased economic activity, people started building houses in the places that were the lowest. So you can see how all these lineages, and they have a kind of a logic in themselves which is appealing, and where people can say, okay, it's a good thing to do this, but if you take them all together and you see how they act out when they interact, they produce a situation where a hurricane can have such a devastating effect. And moreover, this impact was spread unevenly, not so much because the flooding happened mainly in areas where poorer people were living, but it happened because people in lower incomes, they didn't actually have the means to evacuate. Yeah, so when we already knew that it was happening, some people could leave and other people could not leave. So analyzing our two examples explicitly as a process is quite revealing. And I just want to give you a flavor of what I think is interesting in that. So one thing is that careful analysis does show that impacts are often the result of lineages that start a long time ago. And crucially, in those lineages, the negative impacts were often predicted with sometimes impressive clarity and precision. It also reveals past dependencies where we lock our economy into linear systems or systematically prioritize economic gain for some over the safety of all. The example of Katrina reveals how a recurring phenomenon like a flooding needs to be carefully unpacked, as an unfolding at a particular time is shaped by the events of previous floodings. Sometimes even floodings that happen in other places, they can also have an impact on the specific flooding. So rather than seeing them as independent cases, we have to look them as connected events and connected lineages and study them in relation to one another. And basically the work that I would like to do here and that I have been doing for a long time, and I want to sort of continue doing that with more people, is to use this analytical approach. So what is the added value of this? Well, the first the main thing that it gives us is actually a way of systematically comparing different situations, different processes and different cases. So we can compare Katrina to the Limburg flooding in 2021. Or we can compare the rapid sort of diffusion of plastic bottles with the diffusion of electric vehicles or more sustainable ways of production and consumption. And what can we learn from those cases which we maybe don't want for cases that we do want? So that comparison, that is really the key why we want to do this, or why I want to do this. And of course, this leads us also into sort of possible ways of theorizing about process. And I would just hint at a couple of possibilities in that sense. And the first one is transition theory. And I always like to say that at MSI, or the precursor of MSI, transition theory and thinking about transitions was really MSI was one of the places where that started, let's put it that way. And that's significant because transition theory is by now one of the dominant ways in which to think about how we can sort of transform our society and make it more sustainable. And that theory was very explicitly developed as a process theory. It was really developed from the standpoint we have to look at the process of change rather than at the structure and how it manifests itself. And I think that transition theory, and more specifically ideas about strategic niche management and transition pathways, and René, you have been one of the founding fathers, I would say, of that line of thinking. That theorizing fits really well with this very systematic way of looking at process. And it also helps us to deal with a more contemporary question, which is not so much about individual transitions, but it's really about the question, how do different transitions intersect? Because we want a more circular economy, we want also the net zero economy, we also want military safety. So there's a lot of things that we want to change in our society, and how do all these change trajectories intersect? And maybe they sort of accelerate each other, but they can also work against each other. So this is a relevant question to reflect on and to work on. Another fertile starting point for theorizing is the notion of social and socio-ecological tipping points, which has emerged in the last 5 to 10 years. A tipping point is a quality of a system. As it goes through a process of change, there is a point where its fundamental characteristics change. A good example we all know is how water can get progressively colder. But once it reaches a certain temperature, it changes from fluid into a solid, from water into ice. So that's because the water as a system has crossed the tipping point. And this notion of a tipping point is really interesting because we would really like to understand much better how in a society we also have maybe some of those tipping points where if you go beyond them, then suddenly the system starts behaving in a very different way, where maybe there is an incentive to be more sustainable rather than constantly having to push this sort of big ball on, further up the mountain. And if we want to understand those tipping points, we really need to look at societal change processes. We can't do that by comparing pictures of society at different points in time. And just to be clear, this is not just an academic effort, although it's nice to write academic papers about it, I'm not going to lie about it. But it's also something that we have found to be really helpful in working with stakeholders in actual processes of change. And this picture here, you can't read all the detail, but when we use this, then it's like a big poster that we put on the table, and we have people. So this is a poster which shows, if you look at the timeline from 1880 to 2020, this is a poster that we used when talking with people in the UK healthcare system, the NHS, on how it came about that single-use plastic devices are so prevalent in that system and why it's so difficult to get away from that. And looking at that history, looking at that timeline, it's an approach called learning history. It actually helps people a lot to understand where they are coming from and why the system is as it currently is. And it also makes them appreciate more how long those processes actually change. So it basically sort of makes you aware of the fact, well, we can say that we want a circular economy in 5 years, but it's actually not going to happen, right? Or it will be very difficult to happen, or we will have to have a very fundamental change. So we are not just using those fancy pictures to write academic articles, we also use them in workshops. And first of all, at first I was really sort of reluctant to do this because I thought this is never going to work, right? Who will actually sort of engage with this picture? But it actually works really well because people like diving into it, finding where they are in the system, see how they're connected to other parts. And so we've had really good workshops doing that. I go to my next topic, which is transdisciplinarity. And that's our final focal point, which I would like to introduce to the work of Elinor Ostrom. She had an interest in the way in which people, in different times and contexts, succeed in sustainably managing a resource. And initially she studied water resources that can be easily depleted if they are not well organized. So this slide shows a canal which is part of a system of canals in Spain, close to Valencia, which has been built hundreds of years ago, and ever since then has been managed by local communities in such a way that their land is always, that there's always water to irrigate their land. And they have a management system that makes sure that nobody is using so much water that there's nothing left for the people further downstream. Or in a week or in a month's time. So this is the basic principle of the basic sort of issue that Ostrom was researching. How do people sometimes succeed in developing a way of organizing the use of a resource in such a way that you can actually sort of keep on using it. So the word sustainable is here used in the meaning it had in forestry before it became used in the term sustainable development. It means to harvest a resource, whether that's a forest or a water aquifer or a stock of fish, in such a way that it keeps replenishing. So if you fish and if you don't take out too many fish, then they will reproduce and then you will have just as many fish next year. If you fish too much, then you won't have fish in 5 years' time. The risk that such a resource is overused, and when it happens, the risk is that such resources can and often are overused. And when it happens, it takes a long time, if it's possible at all, to build them back up. And Ostrom uncovered the principles that groups of people, communities, can use to achieve such a sustainable resource use. And a critical component in such a management system is to have a very tight connection between action, decision-making, and the production of knowledge involving the users of the resource. So you actually need to understand the system, how much water is needed, how much water is actually coming through the canal. And you can only do that if the farmers who actually use the water are involved in sort of learning about the system and what happens if you use it in one way rather than another, etc. Such co-creation of knowledge, where researchers engage with process actors, is a key characteristic of the approach to research at the Maastricht Sustainability Institute, MSI. And we label that as transdisciplinarity. And at MSI, we interpret this not so much as transcending the boundaries of academic disciplines, like a biologist and an economist and an industrial ecologist working together, but as illustrated by the work of Ostrom, we see that it's necessary to bring together academics and non-academic knowledge in such a way that we can actually sort of develop insight that is incorporated into decision making. I'm trying to figure out what the time scale is. Nobody's allowed to say anything, right? I'm going to go to the PET bottles. In relation to PET bottles, we see knowledge production sometimes reflecting partial interests, while at other times it's part of collaborative efforts to improve circularity, as in the UK Plastics Pact, where business, government and NGOs seek to share information and develop insight as a basis for coordinated actions to reduce plastic waste. In the case of Katrina, we see how knowledge production is often part of processes of contestation. Proponents of the economic development of the marshlands around New Orleans produce reports that downplay risks. Their adversaries develop insight that shows that those risks are really substantial and that you need to do something. You need to curtail the economic development. This dynamic we know very well also in the Netherlands, because around our national airport we have had this debate for many years. People have written PhD theses about it. One fantastic title of one of these PhD theses is, "This is really a dialogue of the deaf." So people keep talking to each other, but they don't really listen to each other, and they keep sort of reproducing their same arguments without ever coming to some kind of resolution. Such divergent ways of knowledge production indicate the importance of carefully crafting research to ensure that it firmly connects to action. And this is especially relevant when our topical area combines processes of negative ecological impact with uneven distribution across members of society. Some are led to question the relevance of academic work altogether, especially when urgency increases and societal responsiveness seems to wither rather than strengthen, as in the case of climate change. But there remains a key task for scholarship that takes responsibility for providing the knowledge needed to meet those societal challenges. And at this point, I would like to direct the discussion of transdisciplinarity to our current situation. If transdisciplinarity involves divining problems in dialogue with societal stakeholders, it matters a lot what those stakeholders see as important. It's not entirely random, but it wasn't difficult to find this selection of clippings, let's put it that way. And I don't know to what extent you follow this debate or these debates and read the newspapers like I do, as if they still are printed on paper. You see BP, the energy company, or should I say oil company, scales back climate targets as profits hit records. This is from 2023. More recently, the whole debate that Trump initiated about diversity, equity and inclusion, where universities are pressured into sort of leaving behind those kind of targets or even doing research on that. And then also one report about a decision from an association of business schools which has replaced the term diversity and inclusion with community and connectedness. So for me, these terms, they speak to me in terms of, okay, how are we going to deal with this in relation to transdisciplinarity? If transdisciplinarity is about doing research where we define and solve problems together with societal stakeholders. What do we do with societal stakeholders that don't think that diversity and inclusion is important anymore? Do we follow them? Do we go against them? So this is the question. And this is not a trivial question. This is something that I took from the Financial Times. And this shows how executives from business firms, how often they talk about diversity and inclusion. You see that there is a quite rapid rise after 2020, and then after it becomes clear that that Trump is going to be the next president and the stuff that he's been saying about that, then you see that this sort of dramatically drops again. So in my experience, the practice of transdisciplinarity presumes a situation and a set of values that have long been present in societies where we work. An acceptance, more or less, of rational criteria for the assessment of the quality of knowledge and insight, and systems of decision-making which are more or less accessible for all societal members. I'm saying more or less because those things are never perfectly present. But at least we strive for them, or we used to strive for them, and we find them important. And in many ways we have taken them a very long time for granted. And the term transdisciplinarity has developed with that kind of cushion, you could almost say, very much in place. But in the face of such principles receding to the background, transdisciplinarity implies making a thoughtful stance, first of all through individual and collaborating academics who engage with social processes of contestation and exclusion, to make sure marginalized process actors are actually involved. And this means continuous work, as the dynamics of societally relevant research often mean that incumbents, so existing firms, existing policymakers, that they set the agenda for the transdisciplinary research and who is allowed to participate. Secondly, it requires an academic context, institutes, departments, faculties, universities, associations of academics that actively support and defend such work, recognizing and working through the tensions that exist between bringing in money and speaking truth to power. And this is not easy. I'm not saying, you know, why are we not doing this? I understand it's very difficult, but I actually think that this is at this moment in time quite important. So let me connect the 4 focal points. Because those 4 points that I showed you earlier, those are the focal points that I would like to work on myself together with colleagues within the university, outside the university. And of course those terms and what they represent in themselves are interesting, but the main interest for me is in how they connect to each other and what questions they raise if we look at it like that. So first, as a basis for the other connections, understanding our economy as intertwined processes of value definition, production and distribution is a key area of interest. And in my research, I will definitely sort of look at societal change. I've been doing that as long as I've been in the academy. And increasingly, I've also understood that the way to do that and the way that I think you can sort of make the most out of that research is to look at situations where there is contestation. Because situations of contestation act as sites where we can gain insights on how actions and decisions of economic actors and political actors produce recurring dynamics that then become taken for granted. And the general research question here is how and under what circumstances is value contested and redefined with subsequent changes in production and distribution. And I hope to work with my colleagues. I'm going to mention people from MSI because, you know, it's a little bit our party, right? But it doesn't, of course, mean that we're not going to work with other people on this. René, Nancy, Marek, as well as others. You know, the research that you guys are doing, I think that really connects to this point, and I'm really curious to see where we can get if we collaborate on that. The second link grounds the economic process in materiality, the ongoing extraction, transformation, circulation, and disposing of materials, with an evolving natural world that we completely depend on as humans. Here I hope to work with colleagues at FSE and FASOS, as well as a continued collaboration with people at University College London. The work that I'm really interested in is really not to just look at the circular economy of plastics or the circular economy of whatever, but how those different circular economies, how they interact. And, well, I see people nodding, so let's do it. Thirdly, the connection between political economy and materiality leads me to a critical interrogation of timely debates on circular business models and climate adaptation. In my view, the academic work done here is tilted towards a particular type of solutions, leaving out large parts of the solution space that come into view if we take a political economy perspective. So this is about looking at the economy more than just profit-making business. I mean, the economy is much more, and we should look at that if we think about developing the circular economy. So the research question here is, how are solutions to the problems of resource scarcity and climate disruption interacting with inequalities, perpetuating economic processes that benefit some and place many others at a disadvantage? So the question here quite directly goes into the area of just transition, or making sustainability solutions available and equally accessible to all people, rather than just the people who can pay for it or who happen to live in the right neighborhood or in the city, rather than on in rural areas. And there, there's again, I really like the fact that at MSI we have a group of people. It's a quite long list actually here. Christian, Maud, Filippo, Ron, Clarence, among others, that take this question of inequality more or less directly sort of into account in their research. And I think that's really something that, at least I think, is something that we need to do much more in the future. So this links to transdisciplinarity as the orientation towards developing actionable insight to address societal challenges that emerge from the materiality of economies. This fourth area I've explored quite intensively. Marielle has referred to that. I'm not going to go into that at this moment. My work with the UK government. What I learned there in terms of not just doing academic research, but actually sort of working with people and making sure that whatever work you do is used in decision making, that's something that I've been already doing with Nicole, but I want to do that much more. The regional circular economy, it can use a little bit of help from the university, and that's an area that we are going to explore for sure, I think. And again, this is something that we can't do alone, not alone as MSI, not alone as SBE. There we really need to work with people in other schools and faculties. I'm going to, I need to skip a little bit. Yeah, so there is an overlap, but it's still important to highlight it as a separate area, is the need to look at transdisciplinarity as an ongoing process. And there I'm looking specifically at Nick and Nicole, Pantopicon, my, how should I say this, colleagues, friends in arms, when looking at shocks and disruption. Veronique has also done work on that, so it would be really interesting to bring that into play as well. We have the shock box. There it is. This is a workshop tool that we have developed that Nicole and Nick have already used quite a few times in actual situations with decision makers, which helps people using this process perspective with visuals that are very similar to the ones that I showed you earlier, that helps people to think more strategically about how have we dealt with disasters like floodings or other disruptions in the past? How would we deal with an imaginary disruption or disaster? And how can we basically make our system more resilient in such a way that whenever something happens like this, because it will happen at some point, or something will happen at some point, that it doesn't have the devastating impact that it would otherwise have. And then finally, of course, there is the question of how transdisciplinarity leads to political economy, and I've defined political economy very much in relation to values and societal values. And here, yeah, I'm just coming back to the point that I made earlier about how we cannot be complacent and think about transdisciplinarity as happening in a space where democracy and trust in scientific evidence is just there. We have to work hard for that. We have to sort of deal with difficult questions around that. And this area, I think, for us as an institute, and for me personally, in terms of thinking about how my work can have some meaningful impact, there are a number of questions there that I feel are really important that we need to address. I've improvised here to get to the final slide. So let's conclude. The economy as a social material process and transdisciplinary endeavor. I hope that by now you understand a little bit what the title means. I didn't do this on purpose. I did do it on purpose in the sense that I didn't want a title that was very directly sort of, that everybody said, oh, he's going to talk about circular economy. Because I do think that one of the, or for me, one of the points thinking about transdisciplinarity and sort of the engagement between science and people in the real world, so to say, is that we also need to take a stance as academics and be academics or dare to be academics. So we don't have to prove necessarily that we can talk to societal stakeholders. We have to do that. But we also need to show that we are confident as academics. So that's one of the reasons why I chose the title. And maybe that's enough for now. So I would like to paraphrase Newton's quote on giants and say that if I'm doing any meaningful work today, it's because over the years I've had the privilege of being mentored by a few people that very patiently allowed me to grow by reflecting on my work, on being an academic, etc., etc. Nigel Room, Leo Baas, Frans Kersthold, those names probably mean nothing to you, or maybe very little, although Wim is an exception, I know. But I miss those people every day because they really were very important as mentors for me, and I really miss them. And I hope that somewhere, somebody, they don't have to say it, but there are people who actually think about me as being, you know, fulfilling a similar role. Because I think it's really important that we have people that are not just meeting the targets all the time, but actually help other people be better academics. So I would like to thank the College van Bestuur. Very nice that you're here, Jan Chitte, thanks. The Dean of SBE, Marielle. My colleagues at SBE, MSI, SUM 2030, for welcoming me at the university. It's a little bit late that I say this because I've already been here for 3.5 years, but anyway. And even though he left quite quickly, I want to thank Peter Mulgaard for trusting me with the task of leading MSI, because that's it's not easy. It's also an honor, and I really am very thankful for him about that. So this has been a challenge to some extent, and we can talk about that in the drinks if you want. I don't necessarily want to. But I mean, there's also a lot of positives, and I would really like to thank people, first and foremost the ladies at the MSI office, because, you know, we always talk about academic stuff, but I mean, there's other people in the university who do very important work as well, and I don't always have the, always have the awareness to show it, but I really am thankful for that. My colleagues, MSI, old colleagues, new colleagues, very happy to work with you. Anja and Jeroen and others at SUM 2030, and all the other people that I've already met and worked with that I cannot list here at this moment. Thanks a lot for your support, and really looking forward to work with you in the future. This is the last slide. Let's be honest, work doesn't really equal life, and there's much more to life to enjoy than just work. And that, of course, leads me to say something about my loved ones. So I'm going to do that by using the water metaphor. because the river that runs through Maastricht, it eventually sort of ends up in Rotterdam, where my kids live, Daniel, Nestor. I learned a lot from you guys. I'm still learning a lot from you, and I love you very much. And yeah, that's it. Nothing more to say about that. So now I have to stretch the water metaphor a little bit, because water evaporates and then it becomes rain. And if after it's become rain, it lands in Manchester. Everybody knows that. And Manchester is where Risa and I met. Risa, my love, I like to be with you always. Ik heb gezegd.
Well, Frank, are you sure there's only 24 hours in a day? I mean, with what you just described, I think you could analyze the whole world. And there's no lack of contestant challenges at this time. So, and while you were talking, actually, the thing that I was thinking of, it's kind of interesting that you do the best of your findings in situations of contestation. It explains a lot also. We'll talk about that over drinks. But to be very serious again, of course, I'd also like to congratulate you on behalf of the board of Maastricht University School of Business Economics and of Maastricht University's executive board. We are really, really pleased that you took your work to SBE. I think you demonstrated in what you said how many linkages there are to different groups, not only within SBE, but also outside of SBE, and how contemporary and needed the research is that you do. So then this makes it officially time, and we're really past it, to end this festive academic ceremony officially and invite you all for drinks and the other room. And please let the cortege and family move first. Thank you very much, and I close this academic ceremony.
All right, please.